You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, where leadership gets real and personal. This is where we cut through the noise to confront the issues shaping our world, from power and justice to the heart of community change. Hosted by Chanda Smith-Baker.
Steve, welcome to Conversations with Chanda. I'm super amped to talk to you on this very exciting week for you.
Thanks, Chanda. Excited to be here. Really pleasure to get to chat with you.
Good deal. So your book came out this week.
It did. Yeah.
And it looks like you have been all over the place, maybe even in Northfield last night.
Yeah, my hometown. Did a little bit of a hometown swing over at the Grand Theater there. It was really fun.
Yeah. A thing that you may not know about my family is that my grandmother was born in Northfield.
No kidding. I didn't know that at all. Wow.
Yeah, they owned a dry cleaner there. I don't have much history about it, but I have like this affinity to that place and a real commitment to get to know it. Is just part of my own family history and understanding. So I definitely was, I don't know why I didn't know that about you, but I did not know.
Yeah. Well, cows, colleges, and contentment. That's kind of the motto. But it's also a community that's gone through a lot of change, like a lot of Minnesota has. It's a great place to grow up, college town, of course. But then with a lot of immigration issues that our whole state and country are facing, Northfield's seen a huge influx of Hispanic immigrants working at the cereal plant and elsewhere. And that's actually a part of how I got my start in journalism. I was writing about some of those issues that you had a community of Latinos who were living in the trailer park kind of at the edge of town who really weren't integrated very well with the rest of the community because they were there to work. And frankly, Northfield didn't have kind of the structure to embrace these newcomers. And so the first kind of series of pieces I wrote, this is way back in my early 20s at the Northfield News, was about that tension and how it was being ameliorated. And I think it's an ongoing process even here 20 years later.
For sure. One thing that stood out to me right away is sort of this story of reinvention.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, the book is called How I Found Myself in the Midwest. And it's about my journey of, having grown up here, like you mentioned, but then also leaving and spending most of my career in Silicon Valley and then coming back 7 years ago. And not just coming back to Minnesota, which it has its moments of reinvention, but also leaving my job at Google, where I worked for 12 years, and YouTube, and moving into state government, and then now local news. And look, I think all your listeners, every human in the world has their moments of reinvention. That's not unique to me. But I felt like having left Minnesota and come back, there was a boomerang story there that I think resonates with a lot of Minnesotans who do the same. But leaving tech and going to government at a moment when the role of technology in society is shifting so rapidly, and frankly, the role of government is shifting, and under, I'd say, some pretty considerable threats in terms of people's trust of government and its ability to function effectively, was kind of rich with a lot of topics to explore. And the book kind of tracks, I guess, my own personal reinvention of moving from tech into government, but then also I think this state's reinvention, frankly, from a place that has been exceptional for so many reasons that we can talk about, but is also rife with some paradoxes that we can also talk about. And Minnesota is kind of a main character in the story, if you will, in that regard. It's both a memoir of my own reinvention, I suppose, at this point in my life, but also our state's attempts to do the same.
I think that when I think about reinvention, if I look at sort of Google, government, media, I wouldn't have saw the through line, but I understand it better now.
Mm-hmm.
And if I just sit on reinvention for a while, I think that COVID pushed a lot of people to think differently about their lives and how they wanted to be in proximity to either people or things that they had imagined in their lives. How did that particular moment, if at all, what was the driver? Was it a family driver of reinvention? Was it like a dream that was sitting dormant? If you could define maybe those inflection points, because there are many people sitting there, and it is a common question that I get around reinvention.
Well, I think that for me, the decision that Mary and I, my wife, made to move from the Valley, back to Minnesota was a big one for us, obviously, and sparked in part by just family considerations. We had twins, Luke and Violet, who are now 8, but at the time were just 1. We had been through a 5-year-long journey with IVF to have them that had been challenging, as anyone with a fertility journey will know, and felt very lucky, but also quite deliberate about our experience once we were finally able to achieve this dream of building a family. And thought a lot about where we wanted to raise them. But also had a feeling, having worked at Google for a dozen years and Mary even longer than that, that while it was a tremendous company that had all these impacts on the world and had kind of a global footprint, and most of the time I was there was still in kind of this utopia phase of the internet where everything that Google and YouTube were able to do felt like upside and power to the people, had started to feel a little bit more like a culture and technology that was in the bubble, right? And that big tech in Silicon Valley didn't quite understand the rest of the country that their technologies were influencing. And as we looked at Minnesota, a place that certainly isn't Silicon Valley, but has its own momentum in the tech industry, we thought, gosh, this actually is a place with some opportunity professionally too, and thought, let's take a moment to reinvent ourselves. Let's take an experiment and go move to Minnesota. She left Google as before I even did and started her own venture capital firm, which we can talk about. And then for me, I stayed with Google. And then when I got here, transitioned into government. For me, that was I don't know, I hadn't planned on it, but I knew Governor Walz from having volunteered in his campaign way back when he was a school teacher, and felt, this might be a chance to give back or connect with my community in a way that feels more real and rooted than I felt at Google, which I just felt kind of further from my roots and a little bit less tangible impact in. And the book gets into that and sort of how I made that shift personally. And, it was a humbling experience for sure, but I learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. Is the book in part like a love story to a place?
Yeah, it is a little bit. I do love Minnesota. I think there's a lot to love about it. It is not a Pollyannic sort of everything here is great, kind of Garrison Keillor, we're all above average kind of book, though. There's a lot in the book about the paradoxes we face. You talk about them a lot on your podcast, right? And as a white man leading DEED through a period of time that included the pandemic and George Floyd, that's something I grappled with not only as the leader of that agency, but as a person. And, I think in particular, the inequalities the pandemic exposed, and then even more so the murder of George Floyd and all that followed, were ones that obviously we're all grappling with still today. But that in that more precise moment of urgency, we had to navigate pretty quickly to get money to rebuild the corridors that were hit. And I guess for me at a personal level, figuring out, am I the kind of leader that understands these issues? Where do I need to grow personally? I did a lot of work there with colleagues and others that helped, I think, me grow. You and I worked together on some projects at that time that I learned from you in. And so, I don't know, it's a pretty honest reflection on what you learn in these moments of crisis. I would argue that places and people learn a lot more in the tough times than you do when things are easy, and it doesn't try to dodge those things, because I think clumsy conversations, which I think we've all had more of in the last 5 years in this state, are important. So yeah, it's a love letter to Minnesota in a certain way. I hope people outside the state who read it will say, hey, there's actually something pretty interesting happening there, and it's a place worth being. It's not flyover country. And at the same time, I think any honest love letter is honest, right? And shares where growth is needed too. So I enjoyed that process of exploration and writing it.
Yeah, before we sort of jump into your role in government leading DEED, I think sort of these multiple realities that this place holds. You talk about it in the book in terms of the charitable elements, the generosity of the people in this state, the number of things that we've stood up to be more generous. And those things are very true. We've been the first in many measures. And unless you dig in or you're from these communities, you may not understand what sits underneath it. Were you at all surprised? Like, were you aware of just the disparities and the challenges that sit across this state? Or was it something that you really what was revealed in a different way?
Yeah.
And if so, how did that sit? What did that feel like?
Well, I would say, like anyone, I was aware of the disparities in Minnesota, certainly on paper, I would say, before we moved here, because you read about your home state. But also experientially, I mean, Mary and I started way back in 2011 a nonprofit called Silicon North Stars, where before we even moved here, we would bring 16 young people out to Silicon Valley every year for a tech camp. And largely students of color, all of them below the poverty line, and many of them recent immigrants. And we would bring them out to the Valley for a week, and we'd take them to Google and YouTube and Facebook and GoPro and give them a little bit of exposure to tech and to meet leaders in those industries that looked like them and had their same experiences in the past. But also, Mary would put them through a startup boot camp on how to build a business that ended in a kind of pitch to venture capitalists at the end of the week. We love that. You learn a lot about the community through that. But I think when you move here, it's different. And certainly in government, it's different. At a DEED, an agency that exists to grow Minnesota's economy, the never-ending question is, for whom? and how. And there, things get a lot more real, a lot more quick. And you see these gulfs in outcomes for people of different communities and backgrounds. And I guess for me, it was a real learning experience of why that is the way it is, how it might be untangled, where Minnesota might have some blind spots. I talked a lot, both when I was in Deed and afterwards, with leaders like Samuel Myers, who kind of coined the Minnesota paradox and talks about Minnesota being a place that has racism without the racists. This idea that sort of we don't talk about it as openly, but we have all the same structural issues, if not more, of other places. And then you look at just how quickly this state has diversified in the past 25 years. We were extremely white back in the 90s. And then, boom, this kind of inflection point of immigration. And I don't think our culture has frankly caught up to it as fast as it needs to. And you learn that as you dig into the issues and learn from other leaders.
Mm-hmm. You worked in the tech industry that seems to move very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And then you go to government that seems to move very, very slowly.
Oh, I know.
Is that a fair assessment? And what were you able to sort of bring to that role that you think particularly masked the moment? Because not long after you came into Deed, we hit COVID, which required new technologies and new ways of doing things. It almost feels like it was unknowingly a more perfect union than was even understood.
That's well said. I think that's exactly right. I mean, yeah, I came from a culture that prized velocity, right? Like how quickly can you move? And, the whole motto of Google is launch and iterate, which is to say, get a technology out there and let users bang on it and use it so you can figure out how to make it better, or don't make it have to be a polished pearl before you release it. And in government, my very first day in government, to give you an example, the orientation included a slide deck where the very first slide was a picture of a goldfish in a bowl. And it was just, this is your new life. And meaning to say, everyone can see what you're doing. Everyone gets to see what you're doing. And if you ever say or do anything that could end up in the front page of the Star Tribune, don't say or do it. I mean, that is a culture that does not prize trying new things or innovating. And I think that's really a shame. I mean, to speak to this broader issue of where government is today, you see things like Doge and what's happening in Washington with President Trump and what Elon Musk did as these efforts, I think, to respond to a large amount of discontent in this country with traditional institutions and government, but in precisely the wrong way, if you ask me, which is to say, taking a sledgehammer to these institutions. Yes, efficiency is needed, but I argue innovation is needed even more. And what I found in government is there's a lot of government bureaucrats and longtime civil servants who desperately want to innovate, but because they feel like the goldfish in that bowl, they can't as often. And so part of what I tried to do at Deed was create a culture where failure was okay and you had a chance to innovate. But to your point on the pandemic accelerating that, it really did. And I think nothing like a crisis to help move individuals. And suddenly the risk tolerance gets higher, because if you don't take risks and try things, you simply aren't going to be able to get the unemployment insurance checks out on time, or create the small business program that helps stem the tide while we're trying to figure out what this virus is doing and how we can live with it. And I think crisis actually, while incredibly challenging and would never invite it, for me, made the job feel more like Google than I think it would have if we hadn't hit those moments that were so challenging.
Yeah. You came in to help grow our state's economy, stabilize it in parts of our state, and certainly attack the disparities that existed. The pandemic hits, and your role then is to shut down business.
Yeah.
I think right at the opening of your book, you talk about 416,000 jobs lost in that first month of COVID. You come in with this big dream of impact, and very quickly you're doing the opposite of what that looks like while you're in a fishbowl. What was that like, Steve?
It wasn't a job I signed up for. That's true for anybody in government. It rapidly shifted. Yeah, I was going to come in and try to make our department the innovation department. And we did innovate, but in ways that were not what I expected. Yeah, losing those many jobs at once was terrifying. And trying to get unemployment insurance out the door, a program that I only vaguely was aware of, frankly. I mean, I don't mean to say I didn't know what it was, but in terms of how to operate it, knew almost nothing when I came in, was incredibly challenging. We were lucky in Minnesota, not to say we got everything right, but we have a really strong department. It's nation leading, actually, on so many categories where, You had some longtime public servants in those jobs who were able to figure out far new ways to keep the technology rolling, to get payments out. We were the first state in first state in the country to get all three of the new federal programs rolled out to our customers, which is no small feat when you saw folks in Florida and Wisconsin standing in lines around the block to fill out paper applications. So we saw a lot of innovation there. But yeah, the job shifted pretty quickly. And there I would just say I leaned on the advice and example of some other public servants. I mean, watching Jan Malcolm as a health commissioner out in front of the state, sharing her calm, thoughtful, honest, deliberative approach to the health components of the crisis, watching the governor himself be kind of the teacher in chief for a while and just taking the time to explain to Minnesota what we were doing, why we were doing, what we did know and didn't know, all in this environment with no playbook was inspiring to see. So I tried to aspire to those leaders and what they were doing. And I did find in the process that just at a personal level, operating in a place without a playbook suited me a little bit better than one with a playbook written with too many pages. I think something that actually felt more like Google in that environment where, okay, clearly the federal government doesn't really know what we should be doing here. There's not a clear national plan. That isn't to say that federal government didn't end up doing some important things, but really early on, it was like 50 different states running 50 different science experiments. And so, Minnesota tried to do our best to run the best version we could. And the playbook we wrote on the fly took a lot of agility and nimbleness. And I found that to be a more natural fit for my skills. But, one of many authors, obviously, and in a really tragic time. I mean, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around. That was only 5 years ago, and we still have the aftermath of it. But it really reshaped his state and continues to.
Yeah, I'm just going to go down the thread of this line and then we'll jump into the book. Although a lot of this is discussed in the book, folks know the timeline. They know that George Floyd's murder happened, right? Sort of at the beginning of what we were dealing with COVID. Again, just a reflection of a coming to a head, right? Aside from that day where his life was taken, there was sort of an explosion across the globe, but here in a new understanding or conversation around race and equity in our systems. And I have no doubt Dee was involved in those conversations. You were dealing with multiple crises. It also hit us personally.
Yeah.
What was it like being in there? Because there's a lot of people looking in that fishbowl that are very critical of government, and there are many things that we are doing without the playbook right now.
Yeah, I know. Well, the department that I led, I succeeded Tara Hardy, who you know well, and is a phenomenal commissioner and really built a great portfolio to try to carry forward on equity and inclusion. And yet she would say, as I would, there was just still a long ways to go in terms of government meeting some of these needs more effectively. And, I think the challenge in the crisis moment of the murder and the aftermath and the unrest and the destruction and then the rebuilding was, you don't just get to kind of go in and do what you want to do. You got to get a lot of stakeholders on board. And indeed, for us to help get state dollars moving into rebuilding Lake Street and University Avenue and all of the areas that were hit hard meant we had to get votes and buy-in from a Republican Senate who was exhausted with working with a governor who was operating by executive order, as I would argue he needed to, but not fun when you're a legislator, not feeling like you get to do your job. And there were some really natural tensions there. And most of the Republican leadership in the Senate, which at the time was Republican controlled, was pushing back on any state dollars going to help Minneapolis or St. Paul because they felt like, well, they would say those are urban problems for urban dollars to solve. And B, at an even deeper level, felt like the response to the unrest hadn't been adequate enough, and therefore it's on you to solve kind of feeling. Now, I'm not saying that was every legislator's opinion, but you came up against that. So I was just one person in this argument. I would never say I was leading it. It was, we had Mahmoud Noor in the House doing a lot of great work and a lot of other legislators too, Bobby Joe Champion. And then, of course, Eric Pratt in the Senate on the Republican side who got it and wanted to help, but needed to navigate his caucus. We had to find a way to both get dollars to those corridors while also getting dollars to main streets outside of the Twin Cities who were harmed by COVID policies because we were trying to figure out the pandemic. And so this kind of Main Street revitalization program that we launched, not to get too into the weeds of legislation, but was kind of purposely named that because it had to work for more than just the corridors that were hit if you're going to get through the politics of it. I would argue ultimately it got a lot of great dollars where they needed to, and that kind of more holistic approach was good, but it was messy. And for me as a rookie government official, figuring that out, and recognizing that I don't live in these neighborhoods myself, so I really have to default to legislators who do and let them lead on a lot of these things, was a learning experience for me. But it did at the end, I would say, uplift to me that this is a place where we figure it out. Like, we figured out how to work across some partisan lines. We're having this conversation, what is it, just 11 or 12 days since the murder of Melissa Hortman and her husband, and these violent attacks on legislators that seem to be raising the temperature on political violence and discord in a place that has long prized itself as this kind of bipartisan, we rise above it all kind of market. I think that's actually a good, exceptional attitude to hold ourselves to, but we're all grappling with how we go forward after a moment like that, and we need moments to process it, I think. But I will say, having been in the guts of government and seen it happen before, I do believe it's possible. And I think in Minnesota, there is a sense of constructive collaboration that is good, but it's messy. We don't always get it right. But in that moment, I think we got some things right, and a lot more work since then, frankly, by a lot of others. But it was a start.
Yeah. When I was reading the book, I think as you described sort of the policies that were coming forward during COVID, the way that you talked about rural, urban sort of needs, I think I saw it even differently, right? That you made a comment about those that were living in rural communities were like, why does this apply to us? Because we're already naturally sort of segregated and apart from each other. What can you say about both the tensions or the things that we need to understand about where there could be stronger connections and perhaps strategies that would support a state when you're looking at rural-urban division?
Yeah. Well, it's a common refrain in this country to talk about that chasm between kind of rural and urban, and it's real. And I think in Minnesota, it's real too. Historically, we've been a state that has navigated it better than most. The way that state government dollars carry across the state has built some of the best infrastructure of any state in the country. We have the fourth most miles of freeway or highway than any state in the country. You've got this kind of Minnesota identity that comes together around the state fair that is, social scientists tell you, quite contiguous. And I don't mean to be kumbaya about it, but there's a little bit of a good story here with urban and rural connections in our state. But I think the pandemic really tore a lot of that apart, at least exposed where the shifts were. And politically, this was a state that for a long time had, and still does today, could boast the most successful third party in the history of American politics, which was the Farmer Labor Party, that saw this really unique urban-rural coalition between farmers who were fed up with monopolistic control of agriculture and laborers in the cities who were fed up with the bosses who were tamping down unionism. And those two groups came together and ended up electing, through their third party, 3 different Minnesota governors, I think something like a dozen national legislators. So all that to say, we've done it before. The pandemic and other moments have stripped us apart a little bit, and you've seen the politics of rural Minnesota shift rapidly. The range is no longer blue like it once was. But I have found, and I go into the book, some pretty neat examples when you get outside of the Twin Cities of leaders finding ways to bridge the divide. One of them is Benya Krause, a woman who started a group called Lead for America that brings in interns, if you will, or early career professionals to come in and do work in rural communities that they come from, using kind of what they learned when they left and come back. It's almost like a professional boomerang program, if you will. I think that's pretty neat. You look at what some of our tribal communities have done against great challenge and difficulty to develop their economies, not just on the reservation, but in the surrounding communities that are hurting from lack of opportunity. I write about the Mille Lacs Reservation in north central Minnesota and what they've done through MCLV to really build childcare centers and startup ecosystems. So there are some pretty neat examples out there. You got to go looking for them, but I think there's a lot of inspiration when you go local. It's easy to get stressed out right now about the national tensions, and I don't mean to put them aside because they are real and they weigh on us all. But when you do go local, which is one of the big messages of the book, you do find a lot of hope. And I think in Minnesota, yeah, things have shifted, but you get leaders like Benya or Dustin Gosselin up at MCLV doing some really neat things on economic development that do cross those lines. And there's some models here worth lifting up. And I try to do that in the book.
Yeah. Let's talk about the title. How did you land on the title?
Yeah. So it's How I Found Myself in the Midwest. It has 2 meanings, I think. One is like, how did I find myself in the Midwest? And then the other is how I found myself, right? The more kind of deeper philosophical meaning. I think both work. I think we landed on that in collaboration with the publisher on what might connect with those who are also looking for meaning and purpose at a time that I think community feels more more driven apart in some sense. The book is a lot about hope and community and coming together and how to build it. And I think this epidemic of loneliness that we have in our country and community division, which plays itself out both in the fact that people widely report having far less friends than previous generations have reported. 15% of American adult males right now will tell you they have no close friends, and about half of Americans will say they don't have as many close friends as they wish they had. Those are way up this generation than in the past. And then at the broader level of institutions, you see this decline in trust of everything from the military to government to media to churches, and massive, departure from the church community, for example. I write about my own faith in that context because for me, that's been a journey. But that's not true in other countries, that level of declining trust across the spectrum. Other countries don't face that the way we do. And so I write about kind of finding yourself and finding your community in the sense that I do think while it feels so much like the world is happening to us, like technology is happening, we're just trying to kind of catch up, or the change and the tension is just sort of overwhelming, to kind of have a moment of agency that like you can go out there and find yourself and find community. And it takes maybe a different approach. But having come from a culture created by the internet at Google and YouTube, I would argue far more for our physical communities, about walking into the door of a church, about going to a meetup in ways that this isn't rocket science, but I think we kind of need to remind ourselves of it, that that's where the most genuine human connections happen. And yeah, that's a bit of what the title is trying to convey. The working title is actually Flyover No More, because I was trying to be of like, hey, we're not flyover country, but as you write the book, you realize some of the personal stuff is the most resonant with people. And so it became a bit more of a personal title.
Yeah, I started out with sort of a question like, is it sort of a love story to place? And when I was reading it in those lessons, wondering whether or not there were sort of, lessons that you hope other people from outside of the Midwest gain from it. Right? Like, look at us. Don't fly over us. Like, look at
exactly.
us here. But, like a little bit of a celebration of what is working and what has been learned. But what do you think other parts of the country actually could learn from us here or in the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot happening here. Anybody who lives here is listening to this podcast from Minnesota knows that we aren't flyover country. I think that's been widely debunked, but it's still, you talk to friends on the coast, and frankly, for me, part of writing the book was sharing what's happening here with my friends in Silicon Valley and newsletters and other things, and realizing, gosh, they really just think it's completely farmland in this part of the country. Like they just sort of think Minneapolis is cows and chickens, which of course we're proud of agriculture in this state, but there's a lot more happening more broadly. And so I do think the book lifts up our innovation economy, our startup space, our business culture in ways that I think are just, we all know it here, but others don't see it. But I think at a deeper level, one of the things I really get at is that this is a very purpose-driven place. I'll give you an example, like the 5-year business survivability in Minnesota. In other words, if you start a business, if it's around in 5 years, that rate is higher here than almost any other state in the country. I think because people choose stuff they really care about and they stick to it. I think the Valley, where I came from professionally before, Silicon Valley, has all kinds of great technologies and a lot of attention gimmick sort of apps and what have you that kind of swallow your eyeballs. And those are, have changed the world in some positive ways and others negative ways. But the technologies that are created here are like how to make a better technology to keep your heart pumping, or how to make sure your crops grow at a higher yield so you can feed your nation. And that kind of startup ecosystem here that has a lot of innovation here, but is a bit more purpose-driven, I think, is a differentiator that I think people who think all the innovation happens in like the Silicon Valley, Boston, New York hub structure would be emboldened to see it happening elsewhere. And I would argue that for the country more broadly, if we're going to actually make a tech ecosystem that doesn't feel like the one we currently have, where everyone's, big tech's stealing my data and my time and my attention, you're going to have to see more of these tech hubs be thriving outside of those coastal hubs, because you need a diversity of thought, idea, approach. And I mean, I put Minnesota on the top of that list as a place that can do it. But it does take investment by government and universities and others. And we speak about that a little bit in the page.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope that people from this place take? Because sometimes you don't even know the place, right? I imagine that in your time here, you've gotten to learn this place differently than you saw it when you were in Northfield. But what do you hope that people inside of our state take from it? And you all should go get the book and read it. It's really insightful. I certainly learned a lot. But what do you hope that folks get from it that are from here?
I mean, I hope there's a little bit of Midwestern pride in it. I think there's a lot of really unique things about our state that I will say is kind of a native son returned home with a fresh pair of eyes. I got to kind of learn as I researched the state we live in. And it's not a history book by any stretch, but I think there's a lot to be proud of there. It is a state that is exceptional in a lot of ways. It punches above its weight on all these indicators. We've talked about it. And it's also a really sticky place. I think people that move here find it's hard to leave. It's hard to get them to move here in the first place. But I think it's okay to be proud of your community and recognize its faults at the same time. And while the book kind of does both, I think it's a moment where we all could use a little pride in where we're at, given just how tension-filled and oftentimes tragic our communities can feel. Certainly here, most poignantly in the last few weeks, but even just more broadly with the challenges that we face through that has to come with a dose of hope. And I think the book tries to lift that up both in terms of calling upon our history, but also some of the examples that I've seen coming back of people doing some pretty special things. You take, somebody like Jez Hampton, who was this like successful corporate lawyer. I think folks probably know he's running for mayor now, but he took a really unique turn in life and left his corporate law job to start Turn Signal, which creates an app where you can have a lawyer beamed into your car over the phone if you get pulled over, something that he believes and has shown to be the case can lower tensions in some of these moments that have been some of the most challenging points, right, for the Black community and police over time. And so I don't know, that's just one of many examples, but I think there's people trying to do things differently here. You got a ways to go. The Groundbreak Coalition, which you've been engaged in, and other things are examples of there's some things to be hopeful about here. So let's allow ourselves that permission to have some hope.
It's part of what you're saying too, is that I think in a moment, there's either people really hyper-focused on what's happening in DC or they're really not paying attention, right? I mean, that is what I've sort of experienced in my travels. And then you have people that are just focusing on what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And we often hear that government and the way that you engage is local, and you should be very, hyper local in terms of how you engage in democracy, where you are at, where you are from. Like it supports sort of the strength of your own community. And in that way, would you agree with that? Like there's people that are really wrestling with government and you've raised some real tension points, but what would you offer in terms of, what should we be thinking about this moment that we're sitting in? Yeah.
I think that people are wrestling with it. I think that your point about people seeing either the national issues or nothing all, it speaks a little bit to the work that I'm trying to do right now with some colleagues at the Strip, right? Which is that the death of local news, and I say that very intentionally, because in this last 10 years, we've seen 2/3 of the journalists in Minnesota leave the profession entirely. So we see this crisis in information. And the changing of habits the internet has inculcated in people's daily habits of content have really left a gap in terms of just the basic knowledge of what's happening in our communities. And your podcast and KMOJ and other outlets are doing, I think, an admirable job of tacking back against that and making good progress. But it's an uphill battle, even for us at the Strip, with the largest newsroom in the Midwest. And people don't feel like they should pay for news anymore, largely. And so you have to figure out how do you create the kind of journalism that is worth paying for and convince people of that. And so that's a whole nother conversation, I suppose. But I think there's something about people's sense of connection to each other that has to be rooted in just good information about what's happening that feels fact-based and objective and clear. And that's what we're trying to figure out here at the Strip. I think that can help people understand their governments better. The job of a news organization isn't only to hold government accountable, although certainly it is, but it's also to help citizens understand what it's doing overall and like how it works. And I think there's just a huge knowledge gap because of that drop in journalism in our country. That's a challenge. So
I was also struck by, if there's two places, I was going to say two, there's probably more than that because people really, a lot of people don't trust the policing system either, but they really are not trusting government. And media is pretty close second or third or wherever, right? Like in the scope of things. So you go right into the places where they are critical to making a community work, yet the mistrust is so high. And, you insert the things that you're talking about in terms of how do you know where the source of truth sits, right? Like we can all find information that lines up with what we think or hope is true, but it may not actually be factual. And so if you had to give a plug for media, local media, like what would you say to us, especially folks that are like, we just don't trust, sort of the
Hmm.
consumption of it?
Well, I certainly wouldn't begin with a lecture that people should, because I don't think that works, nor do I think it's what people want or need to hear. It's on us to gain your trust as a news organization. It's on us to have reporters that live in the very communities they're reporting on that you believe are telling the truth. And it's on us to do that at a scope and scale that has enough audience together where there is this kind of common sense of fact and goals. But I would say we also can't do it alone. The funding model for journalism is broken. Our print subscriptions are going down at a precipitous rate every year just because of the trends in modern media, and digital subscriptions are on the rise. But that alone won't replace our ability to hire and put more journalists in the communities that they need to cover to build that kind of trust. We're going to need other funding models. So philanthropy is a big one. We are finding new ways to get high net worth individuals or even people who just care a little bit about us and want to give us a few bucks the chance to do it alongside foundations and other institutions. I would say that more broadly, you're going to need to see in this country some government assistance for media, not to influence the coverage, because that would be antithetical to the whole point. But there are models out there that work well. I mean, you look at the BBC in the UK, you look at even some states here in the US who've done such things as payroll tax incentives for hiring journalists, or other economic incentives for advertisers to choose local news as a place to put their ads. There's attempts out there that feel market driven, but help fund the kind of big newsrooms you want to do this work. But again, I wouldn't come at this from say, hey, you should just eat your broccoli and read the news every day, everybody. We have to find ways to be relevant to people. So that's both having reporters who look like the communities they're serving and live in the communities they're serving, but also mediums that we choose, right? If everything's a 1,000-word article, you're just not going to meet a modern media audience. You got to look for snippets. You got to look for video. You got to look for TikTok. You got to look for newsletters. We're trying to really become a modern digital media company that embraces a lot of those mediums. And I give us a fighting shot, but the challenge is steep, and we're going to need a community that rallies around us if we're going to get it right.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm going to loop back to the book for a second before we wrap. Was the book sitting in you for a while, or was it something that just one day you're like, this is it?
I had, like anybody, I guess, who enjoys writing, often wondered, hey, I wonder if I'll ever write a book. That'd be kind of fun, but didn't quite know what it would be about. When I made the move to Minnesota, shifted into government, and then started writing to friends about it and emails and things and getting feedback, I thought, maybe there's some book here. I don't know. And it wasn't until I left my job in government that I had a moment to say, okay, maybe there is something here. And so I put together that pitch. And again, I would say at the beginning, it was very much more focused on Minnesota, almost like a Minnesota sociology book or something. And, national publishers weren't as interested in that, but they were interested in the human story part of it. And so part of the book was sitting in me because it's a very personal story, but as a creative leader too, once you start with anything, it kind of stuff comes out different than when you sat down to write. And so part of the journey of writing a book I discovered is also learning about yourself. And I'd say some of the more poignant moments of the book are about my relationship with Mary, or our fertility journey, or my relationship with my parents and faith and reconnecting and community. And, I think it became a better book because of that, but I don't know if that was the book I knew I was setting out to write when I began. The process itself kind of shapes what you're.
Tell me about when you got it in your hand for the first time.
Yeah, that felt pretty good. It was, you sort of envision that moment in those lonely mornings where you're hacking out some chapter you can't seem to finish. And it was a moment of achievement. And one of the things you feel right away when that moment hits is just how many people helped you get there. Because writing a book's a lot of work. And yes, you're at the center of it, but man, you got to have an editor and a publisher and a family and friends and sources who all make it happen. There's a sense of, wow, I'm kind of lucky to get to have done this. Like, my name's in the cover, and yeah, it's my story and I own that. But man, to get to do it was a kind of a group effort on a lot of people's part. So that was
it's great to be connected. I saw a picture of you and Mary and the twins. And I think I thought about it from a parent perspective, right? Like, you just have these moments where your kids are observing things, like you don't know what they're taking in. And, you're launching in your hometown. I had a kid who had a birthday yesterday who's at a different age, Malik, and thinking about the moments that he's observed in our lives. And as parents, like, just, the reinvention, right? The permission to take the risk on your own behalf, the permission to share a story because you know that it will matter to somebody that reads it. The documentation of what matters to you and how you see things, right? That will be forever on the shelves or accessible in ways down generations of folks that maybe don't know you, but by name, but are like in your bloodline. Like there's just something that I just felt right away when I saw that picture, probably because I'm at that parenting stage on the other side of it. But congratulations to you and your family and for modeling what does it mean to sort of take steps out and to just continue to think big about your own life.
Thanks, Chanda. That's very kind of you. Yeah, it is a family moment, and there's something about it being in a book that feels a degree of permanence, I guess. And yeah, it's been a fun journey to get to tackle, and I hope it speaks to people. You know, it's you write something and you get out into the world, and you just sort of see where it goes. I've now kind of lost control of it, if you will. People will take it, they'll do with it what they want, and I hope that they find some solace in it and some hope in it, and that it can strike a chord.
Sure. Well, it spoke to me. And like I said, I learned things. I'm not telling all the things because I think people should go out and read it or download it on Audible or however they take that information in. But if they wanted to find this book, could you please restate the name of it and where folks would go to find it?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it's called How I Found Myself in the Midwest, a memoir of reinvention. You can Google that, or you can go to stevegrove.com, which might be easier to remember, and you can buy it right from that website too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve, for your contribution. And I certainly have renewed my subscription at the Strip Star Tribune. For those of you that don't know what the Strip is, you certainly have brought in some great community voices. We can see it being reinvented at a time that we do need to be connected. And I do think having news at the same time, incredible news, is certainly one way to build bridges and to make sure that we are sort of starting at the same place, even if our opinions are different. So I appreciate that work.
Yeah. Thank you, Chanda. Thank you for your work too. Love the podcast. It's really an honor to get to chat with you today. So thank you.
If you'd like to explore more content and join our community, find us at conversationswithchanda.com. We have a wonderful collection of episodes featuring notable guests that you can enjoy on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast.